David Carter thought divorce was the hardest battle he would ever face, until his ex-wife was killed on a stormy night and he became the prime suspect. The cameras failed. The city judged. A black father stood alone while whispers grew louder than facts. But one honest officer sensed the truth was buried beneath prejudice and refused to close the case too quickly. This is a story about justice, dignity, and ending racial discrimination. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. Maplewood, Georgia, carried the slow heat of early June like a held breath. The air shimmered above the asphalt, cicadas hummed from the oak trees lining Briarwood Street, and distant thunderclouds gathered beyond the low skyline without yet deciding to break. It was the kind of southern evening that looked peaceful from a distance. Golden light resting gently on porches, trimmed lawns glowing soft green. Yet beneath that calm, the air felt heavy, as if something unspoken lingered between the houses. David Carter once believed his life would always belong to this quiet street. David was 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered with the solid frame of a man who had spent years lifting lumber and drywall at construction sites. His skin was deep brown. His hair cut close in a disciplined fade he maintained himself every Sunday evening. His jaw was strong, often set in restraint rather than anger, and his dark eyes carried a seriousness that had grown heavier over time. To strangers, he seemed reserved, even intimidating at first glance, but to those who knew him well, David was patient, deliberate with his words, and deeply loyal. He had grown up in Cedar Grove, a rural town 2 hours south, raised by grandparents who taught him that dignity was not given. It was carried. He used to come home each evening smelling of sawdust and summer sweat, and Monica would open the door before he even reached it. Monica Carter, 34, was tall and slender, her caramel brown skin smooth and luminous under any light. She wore her natural curls in a neat, shoulder-length style that framed her oval face. Her eyes were hazel brown, sharp, observant, always analyzing the room before speaking. Monica worked as an administrative coordinator at a regional logistics firm in downtown Maplewood. She was organized, precise, and known in her office for solving problems without raising her voice. Yet beneath that calm professionalism was a woman shaped by quiet disappointments. Growing up, she had watched her own mother struggle financially after a divorce, and she carried a private fear of instability. Security mattered to her. Predictability mattered. And when those things began to slip in her marriage, her patience began to erode. They had once been what neighbors described as solid, but financial strain crept in slowly. A delayed promotion for David. A medical bill when Naomi broke her arm at 7. Disagreements about discipline, about savings, about which dreams were realistic. The arguments were rarely explosive. They were colder than that. Silence stretched longer. Doors closed more firmly. Conversations turned into negotiations instead of understanding. The divorce happened quietly, almost politely, no shouting in court, no public drama, just signatures, divided assets, and 2 children watching their world rearrange itself. Elijah Carter, 12 years old, had inherited his father's height and his mother's thoughtful gaze. His skin was the same rich brown as David's, his hair coiled tightly and kept trimmed short. Elijah had once been outgoing, quick to joke, quick to volunteer answers in class, but since the divorce, something inside him folded inward. He began speaking less at dinner, spending more time in his room assembling model airplanes or scrolling silently through videos. Teachers described him as focused now, but Monica knew better. He was grieving in the only way he understood, by retreating. Naomi Carter, 9 years old, was smaller, with wide, curious eyes and long braids tipped with colorful beads she insisted on choosing herself. She carried a softness that seemed untouched by conflict. Naomi responded to the divorce differently. She drew. Pages and pages of drawings. 4 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a bright sun overhead. She never erased her father from the pictures. In her mind, the family still stood together. David moved into a small one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Maplewood. The building was older, brick faded and stair rails slightly rusted but clean. Inside, his space was modest. Second-hand couch, folding dining table, framed photographs of the kids arranged with careful symmetry. He kept the place spotless. Structure was how he maintained control. Every weekend, without fail, David drove his dark blue pickup back to Briarwood Street. He would stand at the edge of the driveway, hands tucked briefly into his jeans pockets before knocking, as if reminding himself he still belonged in some way. When the door opened, Naomi usually ran first, colliding into his waist. Elijah followed more slowly, but never refused the hug. They went for ice cream at Miller's Creamery. They visited Grant Park and tossed a football until sunset. David listened more than he spoke. He asked about school, about friends, about dreams. He never said a negative word about Monica in front of them. Monica noticed that. Outwardly, she remained composed. At work, she arrived early, left late, and maintained her reputation for reliability. Her colleagues often complimented her resilience. But inside, she felt the strain of single parenthood pressing against her ribs. There were evenings when she stood alone in the kitchen after the kids were asleep, staring at unpaid bills on the counter. Pride prevented her from calling David for help. Independence had become her armor. One Thursday afternoon, her co-worker, Lisa Hernandez, a petite woman in her 40s with warm brown skin and quick laughter, placed a gentle hand on Monica's desk. "You don't have to carry everything alone," Lisa said softly. Monica smiled politely. "I'm fine." But she wasn't. Summer arrived fully by late June. School let out. The house grew quieter during weekdays without the routine of homework and bus schedules. David made a decision. One Saturday, as they sat beneath the shade trees at Grant Park, he looked at his children carefully before speaking. "How would you two feel about spending a few weeks in Cedar Grove?" he asked. Naomi's eyes widened. "With Grandma Ruth?" Grandma Ruth Carter was 72, short and sturdy with silver braids pinned neatly at the back of her head and a voice that could command a church choir without a microphone. She had raised David after his mother passed away when he was 10. Ruth was practical, prayerful, and known for peach cobbler that tasted like memory itself. Beside her lived Harold Carter, David's grandfather, 75, tall even in age, with weathered hands and calm gray eyes. He spoke little, but observed everything. The kind of man who fixed broken fences without complaint. Cedar Grove itself was slow and green, a lake that mirrored sunsets, cornfields stretching wide, fireflies at night. It was a world away from Maplewood's tension. Elijah hesitated at first. "Will Mom be okay alone?" David paused before answering. "Your mom is strong. She'll be okay. And it's just for a few weeks." Monica agreed to the plan, though a flicker of loneliness passed through her chest when she packed their bags. She reminded herself that the quiet would give her space to breathe. The morning they left, Maplewood was bright and cloudless. Naomi hugged her mother tightly, beads clicking softly. Elijah held on a moment longer than usual. David loaded the truck carefully, double-checking seatbelts before driving south towards Cedar Grove. As the city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, Monica stood alone on the porch. The house behind her felt larger than it ever had. Empty rooms carried echoes of laughter that seemed too recent to already be gone. She walked inside slowly, closing the door with a soft click. For the first time since the divorce, she was truly alone in the home that once held all four of them. Outside, the cicadas continued their song. The sky above Maplewood remained deceptively calm. The fractures beneath the quiet smiles had not yet revealed how deep they truly ran. And summer had only just begun. By the third week of June, Maplewood's heat had turned restless. The sky that afternoon had been a pale, oppressive gray, the kind that pressed low over rooftops and made even the birds quiet. The air smelled metallic, heavy with the promise of rain. Monica Carter left her office building just before 6, heels clicking against the polished tile of the lobby as distant thunder rolled beyond the glass doors. Her workplace, Fulton Regional Logistics, occupied the 10th floor of a concrete tower downtown. The fluorescent lights inside hummed constantly, and the air conditioning ran cold enough to make most employees keep sweaters at their desks. Monica's supervisor, Patricia Langford, a tall white woman in her early 50s with sharp cheekbones, steel-gray hair cut in a precise bob, and an expression permanently poised between approval and critique, had stopped by Monica's desk that afternoon. "Take care driving home," Patricia had said briskly. "Storms coming in fast." Patricia was known for her efficiency and emotional distance. Years earlier, a messy corporate scandal had cost her a promotion, and since then she trusted documentation more than people. Monica respected her, but never felt fully seen by her. "I will," Monica replied with a professional smile. She drove home under darkening skies, windshield wipers already sweeping light drops from the glass. The radio crackled with weather warnings. Isolated thunderstorms, strong winds expected by nightfall. She turned it off. Silence felt safer. When she stepped inside the house on Briarwood Street, the quiet was immediate and absolute. No television in the background. No footsteps above her. The walls seemed to echo her own breathing. She placed her keys carefully in the ceramic bowl Naomi had painted in art class, still decorated with uneven purple hearts. Monica moved through her evening routine with deliberate steadiness. She reheated leftover pasta, ate at the kitchen island instead of the dining table, and checked her phone for messages from David confirming the kids had reached Cedar Grove safely. There was a photo. Naomi smiling wide beside Grandma Ruth's rose bushes. Elijah pretending not to smile, but failing. Monica stared at the image longer than she meant to. By 8:30, rain began falling in earnest. The storm did not creep in. It arrived like an argument. Wind rattled the shutters. Water lashed the windows. The oak trees outside bent in protest. Monica stood in the living room, arms folded loosely across her chest, watching lightning flicker beyond the curtains. She had always disliked storms. As a child, she remembered hiding beneath blankets while her mother worked night shifts, the thunder shaking the small apartment walls. She had promised herself she would never again feel small in the dark. Another flash split the sky. The power flickered but held. She walked toward the large front window, drawn by the violence of the rain. The streetlights cast hazy halos through the downpour. For a moment, she simply watched water race down the glass. Then lightning struck again, brilliant and blinding. In that fraction of a second, she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of her front yard. Tall, motionless, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the night except when illuminated by the lightning's white glare. The hood of a rain jacket shadowed the face completely. The figure stood not near the sidewalk, but closer, just beyond the small maple tree David had planted years ago. Monica's heart thudded sharply. She blinked. The yard was swallowed in darkness once more. Rain blurred everything into indistinct shapes. "You're imagining things," she whispered aloud, her voice thin against the thunder. Another flash. The figure remained. Closer than she remembered. This time, she noticed the posture. Shoulders slightly hunched forward as if studying the house, and in the right hand, angled downward, something long caught the light. Metal, perhaps, reflective. Too straight to be a branch. Her breath shortened. Monica stepped back from the window slowly, pulse pounding in her ears. She strained to hear over the storm. Nothing but wind and rain. She moved quickly now, instinct replacing doubt. First, she checked the front door, locked. She slid the deadbolt firmly into place. Then the back door leading to the patio, also locked, though she tested it twice to be certain. She hurried upstairs to confirm the bedroom windows were secured. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the hallway for a split second in pale blue light. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused. Had she heard something? A faint metallic click from below. She froze. The house creaked often in bad weather. She knew that, old wood expanding, contracting. But this sound felt deliberate, out of rhythm with the storm. Monica grabbed her phone from her pocket and dialed 911. The line rang once, twice. The storm crackled in her ear. Then static. No signal, she muttered, glancing at the screen. The cellular bars flickered weakly. The power flickered again. Downstairs, another sound. Softer this time, like pressure against a door. She hurried back down, feet nearly slipping on the polished wood steps. Her mind raced through possibilities. Maybe a branch had broken off and struck the house. Maybe a neighbor needed help. Maybe... The front door handle turned. Slowly. Monica stopped halfway across the living room. The handle turned again, more firmly. She backed away, heart hammering. The deadbolt held, but the frame shuddered under force. Rain lashed harder against the door as if aiding the assault. "Go away!" she shouted, though her voice trembled. Another strike against the door. The wood groaned. She turned toward the kitchen, searching desperately for something to defend herself with. Her hand found a carving knife from the counter. It felt small, inadequate. A deafening crack split the room. The door burst inward. Wind and rain surged inside, scattering papers and knocking a framed photograph from the wall. In the doorway stood the dark figure. Face still obscured, rain dripping steadily from the hood. For a suspended moment, neither moved. Monica stepped backward, knife raised with shaking hands. "Please," she breathed. Lightning filled the room with blinding light once more. In that illumination, the object in the intruder's hand gleamed unmistakably, long, sharp, deliberate. The figure advanced. Monica turned and ran toward the back hallway, but the floor was slick with rainwater. Her foot slipped. She fell hard against the edge of the dining table, pain shooting through her side. Heavy footsteps followed. The storm outside roared as if drowning out everything within the walls. There was a struggle, brief, chaotic, desperate. A chair overturned. Glass shattered. Then silence began to reclaim the house. The storm gradually moved east, thunder retreating into distant rumbles. Rain softened to a steady drizzle. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside, the lights flickered one last time before stabilizing. The house stood open to the night. By morning, Maplewood woke beneath washed skies. Birds returned hesitantly to the trees. Neighbors stepped onto porches to survey fallen branches and scattered debris. No one on Briarwood Street noticed the Carter house at first. Its curtains remained half-drawn. The door partially ajar. The storm had passed. And within the quiet that followed, everything had changed. 2 weeks later, the road back to Maplewood shimmered beneath a pale afternoon sun. David Carter drove north from Cedar Grove with both hands steady on the wheel, the familiar rhythm of highway lines sliding beneath the truck. Beside him, Elijah sat upright, headphones around his neck but not playing music, staring out the window. In the back seat, Naomi held a mason jar filled with firefly she had insisted on bringing part of the way, though most had already been released before they left her grandparents' porch. Cedar Grove had wrapped them in warmth. Grandma Ruth's laughter, Grandpa Harold's quiet wisdom, lake water cool against sunburned skin. But summer was moving forward, and responsibilities waited in Maplewood. David glanced in the rearview mirror. "You ready to see Mom?" he asked gently. Naomi nodded quickly. Elijah gave a smaller, hesitant shrug. Elijah's silence had deepened over the past weeks. At Cedar Grove, he had spoken little about his mother, though sometimes David caught him staring at his phone as if debating whether to text her. Elijah's features, strong brow, steady dark eyes, mirrored his father's, but his emotions were less guarded. He absorbed tension the way dry earth absorbs rain. They reached Briarwood Street just past 4 in the afternoon. The neighborhood looked unchanged, lawns trimmed, mailboxes upright. Mrs. Henderson across the street watered her hydrangeas as usual. Mrs. Clara Henderson was a white woman in her late 60s, tall and thin with short silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had lived on Briarwood for over 30 years and carried herself with a mixture of politeness and watchfulness. Her husband had passed 5 years earlier, and since then she filled her days tending her garden and observing the street like an unofficial sentinel. She paused when she saw David's truck pull into the driveway. The Carter house stood still beneath the afternoon light. David frowned. The front door was slightly ajar. At first, he assumed Monica might have stepped out briefly and forgotten to latch it properly. But Monica was not careless. She checked locks, twice, always. He cut the engine slowly. "Stay here a second," he told the kids. But Naomi had already unbuckled her seatbelt. "Mom!" she called, hopping out of the truck. David moved quickly after her. As he stepped onto the porch, a faint odor reached him. Not strong at first, just something sour in the air beneath the scent of damp wood. He pushed the door open fully. The smell hit harder now. Metallic, heavy, unmistakable. David froze. The living room looked wrong. A chair overturned, papers scattered across the floor, one curtain partially torn from its rod, the front door frame splintered near the lock. "Mom?" Naomi's voice wavered from behind him. Elijah stepped inside before David could stop him. He took 2 steps forward, then halted. His face drained of color. David's pulse roared in his ears. He moved further into the house, each step slow, dread tightening his chest. The silence was unnatural. He reached the dining area and saw it. He staggered backward. "Outside," he said hoarsely, turning sharply toward the children. "Now!" Naomi didn't understand at first. Elijah did. His eyes widened, then hardened. He grabbed his sister's wrist firmly. "Come on," he whispered urgently, pulling her toward the door. "But now!" They ran onto the lawn. David's hands trembled as he pulled his phone from his pocket. He dialed 911 with fingers that felt disconnected from his body. "My ex-wife," he managed. "Something's happened. Please, just send someone." Mrs. Henderson had crossed the street by then, drawn by the raised voices. Her expression shifted when she caught the smell drifting outward. "Oh my God," she breathed. Within minutes, sirens filled Briarwood Street. Officer Mark Reynolds was the first to arrive, a broad-shouldered white man in his early 40s with a shaved head and a permanent crease between his brows. He moved with confidence bordering on impatience. Years in uniform had hardened his posture. He stepped from the patrol car, scanning the scene quickly. "Who made the call?" he demanded. David raised his hand slowly. Reynolds' eyes lingered on him a moment longer than necessary. Inside, officers moved cautiously through the house. One secured the perimeter with yellow tape. Another photographed the damage near the door. Elijah stood rigid beside Naomi on the lawn. Naomi's small hands clutched the fabric of her brother's T-shirt. Her Firefly jar lay forgotten on the grass. An ambulance arrived, though there was no urgency in the paramedics' pace. Detective Laura Kim joined the scene shortly after. A Korean-American woman in her late 30s, medium height with sharp features and hair pulled tightly into a low bun. Her eyes were steady, analytical. Unlike Reynolds, she spoke quietly but directly. "Mr. Carter," she said, stepping toward David. "When was the last time you saw your ex-wife?" "2 weeks ago," he replied, "before I took the kids to Cedar Grove." She nodded once, making notes. "Anyone else have access to the house?" "No." Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat softly from nearby. "They used to argue," she said, not loudly but enough to be heard, "before the divorce." David turned sharply toward her, stunned. "I heard shouting a few times," she added, folding her arms. Reynolds's pen paused midair. Inside the house, technicians examined the security system. A young forensic analyst named Tyler Grant, thin, pale, barely 25, with nervous energy and wire-rimmed glasses, stepped outside holding a tablet. "Sir," Tyler said to Reynolds, "camera data's missing. Looks like the last week's been wiped." "Wiped?" Reynolds repeated. "Yes, sir. The previous footage is intact, but the recent data, gone." Reynolds glanced at David again. "When were you last inside this house?" he asked. David swallowed. 2 weeks ago, picking up the kids." Tyler scrolled through older footage. There it was. David entering, carrying a duffel bag, leaving shortly after with Elijah and Naomi. Reynolds's jaw tightened. "Convenient," he muttered. Naomi began to cry then. Quiet, confused sobs. Elijah wrapped an arm around her shoulders, but his eyes remained fixed on his father. Not with comfort, with uncertainty. By early evening, Briarwood Street buzzed with speculation. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, voices low but animated. Phones appeared. Photos were taken discreetly. A local news van arrived just before sunset. Reporter Jason Mills stepped out, adjusting his navy blazer. He was in his early 30s, sandy-haired, with an eager expression that sharpened whenever a camera turned on. He thrived on headlines that stirred reaction. "Tragic discovery in Maplewood," he rehearsed under his breath before going live. Within hours, social media carried a simplified narrative. Divorced couple. Reported arguments. Ex-husband last seen at the house. Missing camera footage. The story wrote itself in the public mind. Detective Kim approached David again as officers prepared to transport him for questioning. "For now, we need you to come with us," she said evenly. "Am I under arrest?" he asked. Reynolds stepped forward instead of her. "You're a person of interest," he replied. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Elijah stepped closer to his father. "Dad?" David looked at his son, searching his face. "I didn't," he began, but stopped. There were no words strong enough for this moment. Naomi clung tighter to Elijah. Handcuffs clicked around David's wrists. The metallic sound cut deeper than the storm had. Mrs. Henderson watched from across the street, lips pressed thin. The news camera zoomed in as officers guided David toward the patrol car. Jason Mills's voice lowered dramatically as he narrated the scene for viewers who had never met the Carter family, but now believed they understood it. Elijah's gaze followed his father silently, and in that gaze, doubt had begun to grow. The house on Briarwood Street stood sealed behind bright yellow tape as the sun dipped below the trees. Inside, evidence markers dotted the floor. Outside, whispers moved faster than facts. David Carter sat in the back of the patrol car, staring through the metal divider at the fading light. He had come home to tragedy, and now he was being taken away from it. The courthouse in downtown Maplewood stood tall and pale beneath a cloudless sky, its white columns casting long shadows across the stone steps. Reporters had gathered early, camera tripods lined neatly along the sidewalk as if arranged for a spectacle rather than a proceeding of law. The air carried the dry heat of late June, thick and unmoving, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere felt colder. David Carter sat at the defense table in a dark navy suit that no longer fit quite right. The weeks in county holding had taken weight from his shoulders and light from his eyes. His usually steady posture had softened, not broken, but bent beneath pressure. His wrists bore faint marks where metal had rested too long. He kept his hands folded in front of him, fingers interlocked tightly as if holding himself together through sheer will. Beside him sat his public defender, Melissa Grant, A woman in her early 40s with auburn hair pulled into a low bun and rectangular glasses perched on a narrow nose. Melissa was slim, almost fragile in appearance, but her voice carried clarity when she chose to use it. She had entered public defense work after witnessing her older brother serve time for a crime he did not commit, an experience that sharpened her distrust of rushed judgments. Yet even she looked weary today, aware of the uphill battle ahead. Across the aisle stood Assistant District Attorney Charles Whitaker. Whitaker was in his mid-50s, tall with a broad chest and a commanding presence cultivated through decades in the courtroom. His silver hair was neatly parted, his suit immaculate. He spoke with measured authority and rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. Jurors listened when he spoke. He believed in convictions. He believed in closure. And above all, he believed in maintaining public confidence in the system. He rose slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitaker began, pacing deliberately before the jury, "this case is not complicated." His tone was calm, almost reassuring. "We have a divorced couple, a documented history of conflict, a man seen entering the home shortly before the crime, security footage conveniently erased, a forced entry staged to mislead." He paused. Anger leaves fingerprints. Motive leaves patterns. And sometimes, the person closest to tragedy is the one who caused it. The words settled heavily in the room. David stared straight ahead. Melissa stood to object at certain points, but the narrative had already begun forming in the minds of listeners. The prosecution presented neighbors who recalled arguments months earlier. Mrs. Henderson testified, voice trembling but firm, describing raised voices she had heard through open windows. Each detail, though small and dated, was woven into a portrait of volatility. Outside, the media amplified the message. Jason Mills stood before cameras again, tie slightly loosened now in the afternoon heat. The prosecution paints a troubling picture of domestic tension escalating to violence, he reported with solemn gravity. Many are calling this a tragic but predictable outcome. On social media, headlines spread faster than context. Dangerous husband on trial. Domestic dispute turns deadly. The language hardened by the hour. At Maplewood Middle School, Elijah and Naomi felt the ripple effects. Elijah sat at the back of his classroom, shoulders rigid. The teacher's voice droned indistinctly in the background while whispers floated between desks. A boy named Trevor Haynes, tall for his age, sandy-haired, known more for bravado than empathy, leaned back in his chair. "My mom says his dad snapped," Trevor muttered, loudly enough to be heard. "Guess you never know what people are capable of." Elijah's jaw tightened. He stared at his desk, willing himself not to respond. But when Trevor added, "Maybe it runs in the family," something inside Elijah fractured. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against tile. "What did you say?" Elijah's voice was low but shaking. The teacher turned too late. Elijah lunged, fists colliding with Trevor's shoulder. The scuffle was brief, chaotic, more desperation than aggression, but enough to draw gasps from classmates. 2 staff members separated them quickly. In the principal's office, Elijah sat with arms folded, eyes burning not with rage, but humiliation. "I'm not like him," he muttered under his breath, though he no longer knew who him referred to. Naomi's experience was quieter but no less painful. In her 3rd-grade classroom, she overheard 2 girls near the pencil sharpener. "My dad says her dad's dangerous," one whispered. "That's why the police took him." Naomi clutched her notebook tightly. She did not argue. She did not cry. Instead, she drew that afternoon. A small house beneath storm clouds, only 3 stick figures standing together this time. At Cedar Grove, Ruth and Harold Carter followed every development through local broadcasts. Ruth sat upright in her wooden rocking chair each evening, Bible resting open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed on the television. Her once steady hands trembled slightly now. She had lived through segregation, through marches and closed doors, through watching men judged before heard. She recognized the pattern too well. "They've already decided," she murmured. Harold stood by the window, arms crossed over his chest, silent as always. His belief in justice had been shaped by hardship. He trusted in God more readily than in institutions. "We pray," he said simply. Back in the courtroom, Whitaker continued constructing his narrative. He emphasized David's presence at the house weeks earlier, framing it as opportunity. He referenced the erased security footage, suggesting technical knowledge. Though no direct forensic evidence tied David to the act, the absence itself was portrayed as cunning. Melissa Grant rose for cross-examination, her voice steady despite the weight in the room. "Is there physical evidence linking my client to the scene?" she asked a forensic analyst. "No direct DNA match," the analyst admitted. "But he was the last known adult inside the house," Whitaker interjected during redirect, reclaiming the momentum. The jury listened. David's eyes drifted briefly toward the gallery where Elijah and Naomi sat between their grandparents. He searched for certainty in their faces. Naomi avoided his gaze. Elijah met it for a moment, then looked away. That small movement hurt more than the prosecutor's words. During a recess, David remained seated while others filed out. The courtroom emptied into muffled hallway chatter. Melissa leaned closer. "We'll keep pushing," she said quietly. "They don't have enough." David nodded faintly, but exhaustion had begun to seep into his bones. Weeks of headlines, weeks of whispers, weeks of watching strangers decide who he was. When proceedings resumed, Whitaker delivered his closing argument for the preliminary hearing with measured gravity. "Justice requires accountability," he said. "We cannot ignore patterns simply because they are uncomfortable." The implication hung in the air. By late afternoon, the judge announced that sufficient grounds existed to move forward formally. Bail was denied pending further proceedings. The gavel struck once. David felt something inside him loosen. Not relief, but resignation. As deputies approached to escort him back into custody, he did not resist. He did not speak. He simply stood. Outside, cameras captured the image of him in handcuffs once more. "Dangerous husband denied bail," Jason Mills reported live. In the back seat of the transport vehicle, David stared at the courthouse steps receding behind tinted glass. For the first time since his arrest, a dangerous thought crossed his mind. Not of guilt, but of surrender. Perhaps no one wanted the truth. Perhaps the narrative was easier. And in a system that moved quickly toward judgment, silence felt like the only thing left to hold. The trial had not ended. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict seemed already delivered. Maplewood Police Department sat beneath humming fluorescent lights and the low murmur of ringing phones. The building was functional rather than impressive. Gray walls, scuffed tile floors, bulletin boards cluttered with notices and commendations from years past. Most officers moved through the halls with practiced efficiency, focused on clearing cases, filing reports, meeting deadlines. But Officer Daniel Brooks lingered longer than most. Daniel Brooks was 29 years old, lean and athletic with warm brown skin and thoughtful dark eyes that rarely missed detail. His hair was cut short and neatly shaped, and though he wore the same Navy uniform as everyone else, he carried himself differently. Less hurried, more observant. He had grown up in a small town outside Savannah, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse. She had taught him that integrity was not optional. Daniel had joined law enforcement believing he could protect people like her, ordinary, hard-working citizens who deserved fairness. He sat alone at his desk late one evening, the Carter file open before him. Most officers had already moved on. The department considered the case straightforward. The ex-husband, the erased footage, the domestic history, motive and opportunity neatly aligned. Detective Reynolds had expressed confidence in the prosecution's direction. "We've got what we need," Reynolds had said more than once. But Daniel did not feel that confidence. He scrolled through the digital forensic summary again. The home security system's data had been erased for precisely 7 days leading up to the incident. Not corrupted, not glitched, erased. Cleanly. He leaned back in his chair. "Too clean," he murmured to himself. Daniel had completed a certification course in digital crime processing the previous year. He knew the difference between amateur tampering and professional wiping. This did not look like a frustrated man smashing equipment in anger. It looked deliberate. He opened the evidence log. No DNA linking David Carter to the scene beyond what would naturally exist from prior residents. No fingerprints inconsistent with normal household presence. No recorded purchase of unusual tools or equipment. He flipped through printed photos from the initial search. The forced entry showed splintered wood, yes, but the break pattern suggested pressure applied from outside. That detail had been noted, then glossed over. Daniel frowned. He pulled up the field report filed by Officer Reynolds on the morning of the discovery. Certain lines were brief, almost rushed. The neighbor's testimony about past arguments had been emphasized heavily. Technical questions about the erased footage were summarized in 2 sentences. Daniel's jaw tightened. He stood and walked toward the glass-walled office at the end of the hallway. Inside sat Captain Lawrence Hale. Captain Hale was in his late 50s, tall with a broad frame that had softened slightly with age. His pale skin showed sunspots from decades in patrol cars, and his thinning blonde hair was combed straight back. His eyes were sharp, calculating. Hale had built a reputation for efficiency, closing cases quickly, maintaining strong statistics. He valued order. He valued results. Daniel knocked lightly on the open door. "Yes?" Hale said without looking up from paperwork. "Sir, I've been reviewing the Carter case." Hale sighed faintly. "That one's moving forward just fine. I noticed some inconsistencies." Hale finally looked up. "Inconsistencies?" "The erased camera data. It appears professionally wiped, and there's no direct forensic tie to Carter." Hale leaned back in his chair. "Circumstantial evidence is still evidence, Brooks." "Yes, sir. But shouldn't we examine alternative possibilities?" Hale's expression cooled. "We have a suspect. The DA is confident. Don't overcomplicate what's already clear." Daniel hesitated. "Sir, I've noticed a pattern. Cases involving black male suspects often move faster toward arrest than others." The air shifted. Hale's gaze hardened. "Careful, Brooks." "I'm just asking for thoroughness." Hale's voice dropped. "Your job is to follow procedure, not question departmental integrity." Daniel nodded slowly and stepped back from the doorway. As he returned to his desk, a realization settled in him. Some cases were closed for convenience, not certainty. He reopened the Carter file. Monica Carter's employment records were attached in the background section. Daniel scanned her workplace details more carefully this time. Administrative coordinator, logistics oversight, internal audit involvement 6 months prior. An attached HR memo caught his attention. Employee termination. Ethan Wallace. Daniel clicked open the document. Ethan Wallace, 38 years old at the time of termination. White male. Medium height, lean build, brown hair typically worn unkempt according to ID photo. Eyes, a pale gray blue, slightly hooded. Employment history marked by 2 prior disciplinary warnings for financial discrepancies. Monica Carter had filed the final internal complaint that led to his dismissal for misreporting expense accounts. Daniel leaned forward. He searched internal notes for any follow-up on Wallace. None. He checked public records. Ethan Wallace's registered address was a small apartment complex on the west side of Maplewood. Daniel accessed utility records. Service had been discontinued 3 months earlier. He pulled up traffic citations, nothing recent. "Where did you go?" Daniel muttered. The next morning, Daniel visited Fulton Regional Logistics. The receptionist, a young Latina woman named Sofia Ramirez with dark braided hair pulled neatly over one shoulder and warm, cautious eyes, greeted him politely. "I'm here regarding Monica Carter," Daniel explained gently. Sophia's expression softened. "We were shocked," she said. "She was steady, reliable." Daniel asked about Ethan Wallace. Sophia's brow furrowed. "He left abruptly. Not many people liked him after the audit." "Why?" "He blamed Monica, said she ruined his life." Daniel thanked her and requested access to additional HR documentation. The HR manager, Thomas Keegan, a middle-aged man with thinning red hair and a habit of adjusting his tie when nervous, provided copies. Keegan admitted that Wallace had reacted poorly to termination. "He sent emails," Keegan said quietly. "Accusatory, angry. We blocked him eventually." Daniel requested those archived emails. Back at the station, he reviewed them carefully. One line stood out. "She thinks she can destroy my career and walk away." Daniel felt a chill. He cross-referenced Wallace's financial records. Small cash withdrawals in neighboring counties, temporary storage rental paid in cash. Daniel looked again at the erased camera data from the Carter residence. Professional, intentional, not impulsive. He printed everything and began building a quiet secondary file, separate from the official case binder. Late that evening, Officer Maria Torres approached his desk. Maria was in her early 30s, athletic, with dark curly hair pulled into a tight bun and sharp brown eyes. She had joined the force the same year as Daniel. Unlike some others, she listened before forming conclusions. "You're still on the Carter case?" she asked. "Something's off," Daniel replied. Maria lowered her voice. "Be careful. Hale doesn't like detours." Daniel nodded. He knew that already. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the whiteboard in front of him. Names and timelines began forming connections that had never been explored. David Carter. No direct forensic evidence. Security footage, professionally wiped. Monica Carter. Involved in termination of Ethan Wallace. Ethan Wallace. Angry departure. Disappeared. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Sometimes justice required more than compliance. It required courage. He reopened his laptop and began mapping Wallace's last known movements. Outside, the station lights flickered as a summer storm threatened in the distance. Inside, Officer Daniel Brooks made a decision. He would continue investigating. Quietly, the air outside Maplewood Police Department felt heavier the morning Daniel Brooks decided to act on his suspicions. A thin layer of fog clung to the outskirts of town, softening the edges of trees and telephone lines. Summer was deep now, cicadas relentless in their rhythm, but beneath the familiar sounds of Georgia heat, something darker waited to be uncovered. Daniel sat in his unmarked sedan, engine idling, reviewing the printed trail of transactions he had compiled over the past week. Ethan Wallace had been careful, but not invisible. Small cash withdrawals from ATMs in neighboring counties. A prepaid phone activated 2 days after his termination. A short-term storage rental under a variation of his middle name. Daniel had followed each thread patiently, aware that one misstep could alert both Wallace and possibly his own superiors. He drove south first, toward a rural county line where one of the ATM withdrawals had been recorded. The convenience store was little more than a square brick building with faded signage. Inside, behind the counter, stood a man named Roy Jenkins, mid-60s, lean and weathered with nicotine-stained fingers and a perpetual squint as if the world were always too bright. Daniel showed Roy a photo of Ethan Wallace. Roy scratched his jaw. "Seen him. Came in late. Didn't talk much. Bought gas, paid cash." "When was that?" Daniel asked. "Couple weeks back. Storm night, I think. Roads were bad." Daniel's pulse ticked slightly faster. He thanked Roy and stepped back into the humid air. Storm night. He traced another transaction to a small hardware store near Cedar Grove, the same region where David's parents lived. The coincidence unsettled him. Cedar Grove was quieter than Maplewood, surrounded by fields and pine forests that stretched for miles. Daniel parked outside Mason's Supply, a narrow wooden storefront that smelled of sawdust and oil. Inside, the owner, Walter Mason, a stout man in his late 50s with thick gray eyebrows and a deep southern drawl, recognized the photograph almost immediately. "Yeah, he bought a heavy-duty pry bar," Walter said. "Said he was fixing a barn door." "Did he seem local?" Walter shrugged. "Didn't know him, but he looked angry. You can tell when a man's carrying more than tools." Daniel noted the purchase date. The same week, Monica's security footage had been erased. From there, Daniel followed the prepaid phone activation record. The SIM card had pinged off a rural tower at the edge of Cedar Grove's pine forest. Sparse cabins dotted the area, mostly used for seasonal hunting or temporary stays. He drove slowly down a narrow dirt road until he spotted a small, weather-beaten cabin tucked between trees. A rusted pickup truck sat nearby, partially concealed by brush. Daniel stepped out cautiously. The cabin's porch sagged slightly at one corner. A thin plume of smoke drifted from a metal chimney pipe. The door was closed. He approached quietly, listening. A dog barked from somewhere behind the structure. Rounding the side of the cabin, Daniel saw it. A medium-sized black mutt chained loosely to a post. The dog looked about 3 years old, ribs faintly visible, fur patchy, but eyes alert. It growled low, protective but uncertain. Daniel knelt slowly, keeping his movements calm. "It's okay," he murmured. The dog sniffed the air but did not lunge. Footsteps sounded inside. The cabin door creaked open. Ethan Wallace stepped out. He looked thinner than in his employee ID photo. His once unkempt brown hair had grown longer, falling into his eyes. His gray-blue gaze was sharp but restless. His skin appeared pale against the forest shadows, jaw unshaven. He wore work boots caked in dried mud and a faded flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves. There was tension in his shoulders, the posture of a man expecting confrontation. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, voice guarded. Daniel straightened. "Officer Daniel Brooks, Maplewood PD." Ethan's eyes flickered briefly toward the tree line, calculating. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about Monica Carter." The name hung heavy in the air. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't know what that has to do with me." Daniel stepped closer but kept his tone even. "You were terminated after she filed a report. You sent emails expressing anger. You disappeared shortly afterward." "I moved," Ethan snapped. "That's not illegal." "No," Daniel agreed. "But being near Briarwood Street the night of the storm is." Ethan's face drained slightly of color. Daniel pulled out printed evidence. A TM withdrawals time-stamped, hardware purchase receipts, phone tower pings. "You were within 5 miles of her house that night." Ethan said nothing. Daniel continued. "Security footage from Monica's home was accessed remotely before being erased. The IP trace links to the prepaid phone you activated." Ethan swallowed. "And," Daniel added, glancing toward the cabin floor, "the tread pattern on your boots matches impressions found in her yard." Silence thickened between them. The dog behind Ethan whimpered softly. Daniel watched the man's posture change. The defiance wavered, replaced by something brittle. "She ruined me," Ethan muttered finally. Daniel did not respond. "I worked there 8 years. 8. One audit and suddenly I'm the villain." Ethan's voice grew louder, anger cracking through. "She made it personal." "She reported financial misconduct," Daniel said calmly. Ethan laughed bitterly. "Everyone does small things. She didn't have to escalate." Daniel's gaze remained steady. "So, you erased her security system?" Ethan's hands trembled now. "I know computers," he said quietly. "Freelance jobs. Side work." And you bought a pry bar. Ethan's breathing grew uneven. It was raining, he whispered as if speaking to himself. She wouldn't even look scared at first, just surprised. The confession slipped out, not as pride, but as collapse. Daniel felt the weight of it settle. You planned it, he said. Ethan shook his head weakly. I just wanted to talk, but I kept thinking about the emails she never answered, the job interviews that went nowhere, the way people looked at me afterward. He sank onto the porch step. I lost everything. Daniel's voice remained firm. She lost her life. Ethan covered his face with both hands. Minutes later, backup arrived. Quietly, without sirens. Ethan did not resist when officers cuffed him. His shoulders slumped as though surrender had been inevitable all along. The black dog watched silently as its owner was led away. Back at the station, Daniel presented the evidence directly to Detective Kim and then to Captain Hale. The room was tense as he laid out each piece methodically. Financial records, location data, hardware purchase, digital trace, boot comparison. Hale's expression hardened as realization dawned. You went outside protocol, the captain said. I followed the evidence, Daniel replied evenly. Detective Kim nodded slowly. The timeline fits. Within hours, the district attorney's office was notified. Charges were adjusted. The narrative began to shift. David Carter remained in holding when Daniel walked into the interview room later that evening. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead. David looked up, weary but alert. We found him, Daniel said simply. David stared, searching for confirmation. Ethan Wallace. He confessed. For a moment, David said nothing. Then his eyes closed briefly, not in triumph, but in release. The storm that had swallowed Briarwood Street weeks earlier had finally begun to clear, and the truth, once buried beneath assumption, had stepped into the light. The morning David Carter walked out of Maplewood County Detention Center, the sky was impossibly clear. No storm clouds lingered, no sirens echoed, just an open blue horizon stretching wide above the courthouse steps. The summer air felt lighter than it had in weeks, though the weight inside his chest had not yet fully lifted. The metal doors opened with a dull, mechanical hum. David stepped forward slowly. He looked thinner than when he had entered. His once broad shoulders carried visible strain, but his posture was upright. The uncertainty that had clouded his expression during the trial had softened into something steadier, worn but grounded. He wore the same navy suit from his hearing, slightly wrinkled now, but clean. At the bottom of the steps stood Elijah and Naomi. Elijah had grown taller in what felt like a single month. Grief had aged his eyes, but they no longer held doubt. He stood straight, jaw firm, hands resting awkwardly at his sides as if unsure how to begin. Naomi stood beside him, braids neatly tied with blue ribbons. She held a folded drawing in one hand. Grandma Ruth stood just behind them, upright despite her years, silver braids tucked beneath a wide Sunday hat. Harold Carter stood beside her, tall and silent, his presence as steady as ever. And slightly off to the side stood Officer Daniel Brooks, dressed not in uniform but in a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks. He kept a respectful distance, hands loosely clasped in front of him. David paused at the top step, eyes locking with his children's. Elijah moved first. He stepped forward, crossing the pavement in long strides. Without speaking, he reached out and took his father's hand. Not the hesitant grip of a confused boy, but a deliberate hold. A choice. David's fingers tightened gently around his son's. Naomi stepped closer, eyes shining with the tears she did not bother hiding. I knew you didn't do it, she whispered softly. David knelt carefully to her level, voice unsteady. Thank you, baby. He did not cry loudly. He did not collapse. But the release showed in the way his shoulders dropped slightly, the way his breath deepened for the first time in weeks. Across town, Maplewood was forced to confront itself. News headlines had shifted overnight. Wrongly accused husband released. New suspect confesses in Carter case. The same outlets that had once painted David as dangerous now scrambled to frame the correction. Jason Mills stood outside the courthouse again, but this time his tone was subdued. "In light of new evidence," he reported carefully, "questions are being raised about the speed at which conclusions were drawn." On Briarwood Street, neighbors avoided eye contact. Mrs. Clara Henderson watched quietly from her porch as the Carter family's car passed later that afternoon. Her expression was thoughtful, perhaps regretful. She did not wave, but she did not whisper either. The funeral for Monica Carter took place 2 days later. The church stood modest and white against the Georgia sun, wooden pews polished from decades of use. Inside, lilies and white roses lined the altar. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and candle wax. Monica's casket rested at the front of the sanctuary. David stood beside it, not as a suspect, not as a headline, but as a husband who had once loved her deeply. He wore a black suit this time. His expression was composed, but hollow in places grief had carved out. Elijah stood on his right, Naomi on his left. Their hands remained linked with his. Friends and co-workers filled the pews. Patricia Langford attended, posture as straight as ever but eyes softer than before. Lisa Hernandez wept openly, clutching a tissue tightly. When it was David's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He approached the podium slowly. "Monica was strong," he began, voice low but steady. "Stronger than most people realized. She believed in doing things the right way, even when it cost her." He paused, glancing at his children. "She loved Elijah and Naomi more than anything, and whatever happened between us, that love never changed." There were no accusations in his tone, no bitterness, just truth. After the service, as sunlight poured over the churchyard, Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the gathering. Several community members approached him quietly, shaking his hand. Captain Hale stood at a distance, expression controlled but tight. The department had issued a formal statement recognizing Daniel's diligent follow-up investigation. Recognition did not erase what had nearly happened, but it mattered. In the weeks that followed, small changes rippled through Maplewood. Elijah returned to school differently. Though whispers lingered faintly, he no longer walked with his head lowered. One afternoon, he noticed a flyer pinned near the main office. "Student Law and Debate Club, new members welcome." He stared at it longer than necessary. Later that week, he signed his name. When asked why, he shrugged slightly. "I want to understand how things work," he said quietly, but inside, he wanted something more, to ensure that what happened to his father did not happen so easily again. Naomi, meanwhile, began writing more seriously. Her third-grade teacher, Mrs. Linda Foster, a gentlewoman in her 60s with soft gray curls and kind hazel eyes, assigned an essay titled, "What Justice Means to Me." Naomi wrote carefully, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. "Justice means listening before deciding," she wrote. "It means not thinking someone is bad just because other people say so. It means telling the truth even when it is hard." Mrs. Foster read the essay twice before setting it down, blinking back tears. David, for his part, did not retreat into silence. One evening, at Cedar Grove's small community hall, he stood before a modest crowd gathered on folding chairs. Farmers, teachers, neighbors. Daniel Brooks sat near the back, quietly observing. David cleared his throat. "I was almost buried by assumption," he said. "Not because of evidence, because of a story that felt easier to believe." He did not speak with anger. He spoke with clarity. Justice isn't automatic. It requires people willing to slow down, to ask questions, to look again. He nodded toward Daniel subtly. And sometimes it only takes one person to refuse to look away. Cedar Grove returned to its usual rhythms. Sunsets over the lake, cicadas humming at dusk, fireflies rising from tall grass. The cabin where Ethan Wallace had hidden sat empty now, the black dog rehomed by a local shelter worker named Grace Turner, a soft-spoken woman with sandy hair and a quiet compassion that extended easily to animals and people alike. Life did not erase grief. The Carter home on Briarwood Street eventually reopened. Repairs were made. Walls repainted. Not to forget, but to move forward. On one warm evening, David stood in the backyard with Elijah and Naomi. The maple tree he had planted years earlier cast long shadows across the grass. Elijah tossed a football lightly toward his father. Naomi laughed as it rolled slightly off course. The sky above Maplewood glowed orange and gold. Storms still came as they always would. But the Carters understood something deeper now. Justice was not a guarantee. It was a responsibility. And sometimes after the storm passes, what remains is not just survival, but the courage to stand differently than before. This story reminds us that truth is often quieter than accusation. In everyday life, we are quick to form opinions based on headlines, rumors, or a single perspective. But justice requires patience. It requires listening before judging. It requires courage to question what everyone else seems ready to accept. David's story shows how easily a reputation can be destroyed when fear and bias move faster than facts. It also shows that one honest voice can change the outcome. In our daily lives, we may not face a courtroom, but we face choices. We choose whether to believe gossip or seek truth. We choose whether to treat people based on assumptions or on character. We choose whether to stay silent when something feels wrong or to stand up with integrity. This is also a lesson about racial fairness. A society that judges a person by skin color instead of evidence is a society that weakens itself. True strength comes when we protect justice for everyone, not just for those who look like us. When we defend fairness for others, we defend it for ourselves and for our children. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect. Is there someone in your life you judged too quickly? Is there a situation where you could choose empathy instead of assumption? Small actions shape communities. Honest hearts build stronger cities. Share this story with someone who believes in justice. Leave a comment and tell us what lesson spoke to you the most. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories that inspire courage and integrity. May God bless you and your family. May He guide us to be slower to judge and quicker to love. If you believe that truth will always rise after the storm, type Amen in the comments.